Has a long neck, does not have a long tail. The only animal I know that has a long neck and a long tail is a dinosaur. There are stories and legends from countries all over the world. Every place I travel, I see stuff like this, so I grab my camera and get a picture, you know. Thai seafood restaurant showing the head of a dragon on their boat. Now, why would they build boats with dragon heads on them? There's a Russian medallion showing a man slaying a dragon. A Bulgarian postage stamp has a guy slaying a dragon. Irish writer in 900 AD reported that somebody killed a dragon with iron nails on its tail. Probably the Stegosaurus, of course, though several dinosaurs had these big spikes on their tail. There are several websites about dragons. None of them that I'm aware of. Didn't read through all of them, but they're all secular. They're not at all Christian that I could see. But they do keep interesting articles about dragon stories from ancient literature. So if you want to get into the study of dragons, it's really pretty interesting to see all about the dragons. The Viking ships had these dragon heads on them. If you study Scandinavian literature, you can see the dragon head on this one. Ancient Scandinavian literature has an awful lot of stories about the kraken or the giant dragons of the sea. Well, you figure the Vikings are the guys that are going around the ocean in their boats, you know, conquering villages. Where's the hardest place to exterminate an animal totally? In the water, yeah. Especially the ocean. On land, you could eventually corner it, figure out some way to get it, but on the ocean, you'd have a tough time. And so this is from 1000 AD. Here we have evidence of dragons living with man just 1,000 years ago. In the book called The Unexplained, there's information about this. There's also an account of a dragon called Nithhagar that the Vikings was killed in the book After the Flood by Bill Cooper. According to the Norse legend, Siegfried slew the dragon Fafnir. The dragon had made its home in a cave, and somebody else had buried a treasure in that cave. I'm sure the dragon didn't know that and didn't care, but people wanted the treasure, of course, so you got to kill the dragon to get to it. There are several different stories about how Siegfried slew the dragon. Of course, you know, legends get twisted with time. One story says he dug a pit because they knew the only soft part of the dragon was his belly. So he dug a pit and laid in this pit until the dragon went over him, and then he jabbed his sword up into the dragon's belly. That's one story. Another one is he just charged up there and just stabbed it in the heart, you know. Who knows how it really happened. But Carl Schuker is a scientist in England, has a great book called Dragons, A Natural History. I've got it in my library. Just story after story of people slaying dragons down through history. Marco Polo reported in his memoirs, when he came back from China, he said, the emperor in China raises dragons to pull chariots in his parades. Ceremonial dragons. Well, all you have to do is go to any Chinese restaurant, and you'll see dragons all over the place. It's just a part of their culture. Over in China, you probably saw them all over, didn't you?
Well, they have a different connotation than they do in the West. You see, they represent the king. They're very positive. In the West, they're bad.
In China, the dragon represents the king, and it's very good. Interesting. Well, why on earth would Marco Polo come back and say the emperor is raising dragons to pull chariots in his parades? I think it's probably because the emperor was raising dragons to pull chariots in his parades. Marco Polo was an extremely famous man. Well, he wouldn't want to do something dumb and jeopardize his reputation, I don't think, anyway. A city in France was renamed Nurlug in honor of the man who slew the dragon in the city. I think if we actually could get an unperverted view of history, we would see there's an awful lot of legends that are based on some kind of real story. If you go to the Grand Canyon, you will find carvings on the walls of the Grand Canyon. The Indians did this all over. They call them pictograph, including a picture of a dinosaur. If you look at dinosaurs, many of them had the upright posture, we call that. They walk on two legs, and the front two legs, we assume, were, you know, held up off the ground, similar to an ostrich, I guess, upright posture. Though there are some animals like frogs that walk on four legs. The front two are real tiny, the back two are really big. So the size of the leg doesn't mean he didn't walk on it, necessarily. But why would they carve dragons on the walls of the Grand Canyon? Here's another one with a round body, 4 legs, long neck, long tail. Dr. Delancey was a dentist in Pennsylvania who took these pictures. His wife, Margaret Delancey, his widow, she lives in Percy, Pennsylvania. Right, I've preached up in that city 4 or 5 times, right near there, Sellersville, and up just north of Philadelphia. That's south. You're from Allentown, though, right? Up
That's
south of Scranton. Yeah. He's the one who took these pictures, and she let me use these. In the Aboriginal caves in Australia, there are many legends of dragons from caves in Australia. This was just sent to me, Agawa Rock Art, from, however you pronounce that, Lake Superior Provincial Park, Ontario, Canada. Notice the outline of the dragon with the bumps on his back. This is called cliff art, rock art. There's another name for this. Some people call it oop art. That'd be a good quiz question. OOP means out of place. Out of place artifacts. And so they get the name oop art. That's just a slogan that people use. So if you find something that shouldn't be there, if you're digging down in the ground and you're down in area where it should be from, 500 years ago from some Indian civilization, and you find an Evinrude outboard motor, that would be an out-of-place artifact, right? That shouldn't be there. So oop art is out-of-place artifacts, things that really shouldn't be there. This type of stuff is by the evolutionist. A person who believes in evolution often will classify this kind of material as, we don't understand it, it's an enigma, forget it. I've got whole books of these enigmas that they can't explain. Down in Lima, Peru, if you go south about 8 hours drive through the mountains, you come to the city of Ica. Ica, Peru is right near the desert that is the driest desert in the world. My understanding is it's only rained once there in 400 years. Not a good place for a garden. But the Spanish came through this area about 400 years ago, in the late 1500s. They came through and they saw these strange white lines. Not very wide, but there were these white lines, just somebody scratched like a plow on a field. Perfectly straight lines, for a long ways. Nobody knew what they were until airplanes were invented. When you get way up in the sky, you notice these are pictures of giant images. You ever heard of those before? The Nazca Desert lines, They have spiders and hummingbirds, and 4 or 5 miles long. Sometimes they go right, you come to a mountain, it stops, you go on the other side of the mountain, and it takes off in an exact straight line. So these guys really knew something about surveying and mathematics to be able to do this. Or, there's another reasonable theory, I think. They had flight. They knew how to fly. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. Here's people after the flood living to be 400 years. You could learn a lot in 400 years. People before the flood are 900 years old. You could really learn a lot in 900 years. Plus, you can go talk to your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather because he's still alive. You can get all this. The wisdom would be incredible, the knowledge that was preserved. In the Smithsonian, they have, and I'll show you when I get to video number 7, our question answer, we've got a whole section on was ancient man primitive. We have a book, as a matter of fact, on that topic here that we sell. Or here we do sell the book After the Flood by Bill Cooper. I forgot about that. We just started carrying that. The Puzzle of Ancient Man is a great book, which shows, for instance, pictures of things that are found in graves that just shouldn't be there. Like a grave in South America, they found an airplane. This grave was at least 1,000 years old. An airplane, a little toy airplane. So Smithsonian has it, and they have it labeled as a stylized insect. Tell me that's a stylized insect. In 1571, the Spanish reported finding stones with strange animals carved on them. Now, who remembers roughly when were dinosaurs rediscovered in modern times? The first one was reassembled, the bones put together when? 1809. 1571. By 1571, most dinosaurs were extinct, been killed off by man. They had not been rediscovered yet to put them together in museums. So we have a several hundred-year time lag in here where nobody knew about dinosaurs. Never heard of them. Never saw one. But the Spanish said these stones had strange animals carved on them. They didn't know what they were. They just reported it. You know, we went across this desert and found strange carvings. Today they are known as the Nazca burial stones from the Nazca Desert. They were probably built about the time of Christ, roughly 500 BC to 500 AD. These stones are a little smaller than a football, though they range from, golf ball size to the size of a lazy boy chair. The average is about the size of a football or less. Here's Dr. Decara, a medical doctor from Lima, Peru, who collects the stones. He has 11,000 of them in his collection. These stones have dinosaurs on them. Now, it's interesting, if you really study this topic, and I read Dr. Decara's book, and I know several folks who've been down there many times to study this. I could get one of the stones for $2,000 if I want to spend $2,000 on one, get one of these little Ica stones. I've held them in my hand. It's just an amazing story about these stones. This one, for instance, over 50,000 have been found in Ica. This one shows a Triceratops. Behind him is a Stegosaurus. In front of him is an Ankylosaurus, probably. Off to the left is an Apatosaurus, long neck, and a T-Rex of some kind. Notice on the sides of this one, you see the circles in the skin? Keep that thought in mind. Here's a guy hitting one on the head with something. Dr. Baugh is a friend of mine from Glen Rose, Texas. He has two of the stones. If you're driving across and stop at the museum, you can see his Ica stones that he has there. He went down there and was able, because he's a museum, they do a museum-to-museum transfer. You're not allowed to sell Peruvian treasures, or you'll go to jail. Now, because of this, the people who are finding these stones have to be very careful what they do. Don Patton lives in Garland, Texas. He has one of the stones. You can see some good pictures on him on the website bible.ca, which stands for Canada. /tracks is the. Now, I don't agree with some of the stuff on bible.ca. They do have a lot of interesting material on there on this website. Anton Willett is a friend of mine from Canada. He speaks French. And Spanish and English. He went down there and spent 8 months studying the Ica stones. He gave me the book about the Ica stones that I have, and the pictures that he took of these Ica stones. There's his phone number if you want to call him up, 450-359-4405. Dennis Swift is a pastor in Oregon. I preached at his church, at a large Nazarene church there in Beaverton, Oregon. Has about 2,500 people. He collects the stones also, goes down there twice a year to study this topic, and brings back the stones if he can. Here's, again, notice the circles on the side of the dinosaur. Kind of strange. Here's Dennis Swift holding one with a Triceratops on it. The carvings in these stones are pretty amazing. They all have a coating on them that comes with time. It's called oxidation. Almost all materials, or many materials, if they're exposed to the air, they oxidize. You know, your car starts off bright, shiny paint. After 10 years, if you don't do anything, it'll oxidize and the paint fades. The oxygen actually, gets into the paint and oxidizes it. Well, that's what happens to these stones also. So they analyzed these stones and said that the coating on there, the oxidized coating, would require several hundred years to accumulate that much. So if somebody comes along and says, well, these stones are fake, somebody made them last week, we have several things to prove that that is not true. Number one, the oxidized coating on there says they're at least several hundred years old. Number two, the Spanish reported them 400 years ago, before dinosaurs were even a popular idea. Number three, this circle on the side is interesting. Now, dinosaur bones have been found for the last few hundred years and reassembled. Nobody had ever found dinosaur skin. Dinosaur skin would not fossilize very easily. A few times, skin impressions were found where apparently the dinosaur fell down in the mud. He rotted away, but the mud hardened, and it left behind an impression of his skin, and you can see they did have scales. In 1992, I believe, a Bolivian missionary found fossilized dinosaur skin. This is from Dr. Baugh's museum. Again, on the dinosaur on the left, you can notice the circles on the side. They've discovered now that dinosaur skin has Rosetta patterns, they're called, circles. Now, if the skin wasn't discovered till 1992, But the stones were discovered in 1940s, basically. The Spanish knew about them, but in 1946 they really became popular. People started going after these things. How would they know to put the circles on the side if you're carving them? You would not know to put those circles on the side of the dinosaur because you didn't know dinosaurs had circles in their skin, because no skin had ever been found until 1992. Interesting. Now, because it is illegal to sell Peruvian treasure, they sent, because of this, all the information about these stones, somebody, I think it was NOVA or some science program, sent somebody down there to Peru to investigate. They got down there and they got this, one of the farmers who has produced most of the stones, and he won't tell anybody where he gets them because he's out robbing these graves. That's what he's doing, these old graves. And he sells these stones to tourists or to Dr. DeCara, who buys as many as he can afford. They got this guy on camera and asked him, where do you get these stones? Now understand, if you are getting Peruvian treasures, ancient artifacts, and selling them, you go to jail. They say in Peru, a jail sentence is like a death sentence. Because they're just, you think Mexican jails are bad. They say Peruvian jails are the worst there are. For one thing, they throw you in jail and lock you up. They don't feed you, they don't entertain you, they do nothing for you. If your family on the outside doesn't bring you some food, you will starve to death. Average life expectancy in a Peruvian jail is about 2 years, is what I've been told. So, here's the camera videotaping this Mexican farm, or this Peruvian farmer, and they're asking him the question, where do you get these stones? Right behind the camera are 2 Peruvian police officers. In case he says, I'm digging them up out of a grave and I'm selling them, he's going to go to jail. So the guy stands there in front of the camera and says, oh, I make these stones. It's a hobby of mine. So they gave him one of the stones that had no markings on it, gave him the same kind of rock, and said, here, make one for us. So he carved one out with a scratched the surface like that, and it was lousy. Nothing similar at all to what he had here. But these scientists came home and said, see, they're saying there's dinosaurs lived with humans. We know it's not true. This Peruvian farmer's making these things. It's all a big hoax. And that story is still reported today among the evolutionist circles because they got this one report where somebody went down there and investigated it. Well, it was just simply silly the way that was done. They have the oxidized coating. They had circles in the skin. They can't make them like this. Nobody's been able to now anyway. The simple fact is they're trying to cover up for the obvious. They don't want to admit that maybe man and dinosaurs lived together. Dennis Swift here is holding one. Again, you see the circles on the side of the Tyrannosaurus Rex probably. Here's a guy cutting the head off of one. Obviously, I would think a dinosaur-like creature. Here's a guy riding one. Some have suggested that maybe dinosaurs were used to help build some of the giant buildings, like the Great Pyramid, or the huge stones found up in Peru in the mountains that weigh 20,000 tons. Well, the biggest crane on Earth today can only lift 3,000 tons. There's a picture in there of a 100-ton rock in that book, The Puzzle of Ancient Man. These are up on the top of mountains. And they're cut and they fit together with part of a wall. How do you move a 100-ton stone? Well, some have suggested maybe dinosaurs were involved. In a city called Acámbaro, Mexico, if you look at Mexico City on a map and go west about an hour, you come to the city of Acámbaro. John Turney, I've talked to him on the phone, never met him yet, he's in Connecticut. He's been there many times to study the similar stones that are found in Acámbaro, Mexico. Down there, this stones with dinosaurs and humans on them, it's kind of a cult. They're guarded. It's kind of a secret. They don't want people knowing about this. But at least 56,000 of these stones have been found, and they're locked away in a big museum. John Turney's been in to see them and photographed them. Again, you find dinosaurs and humans together in Acámbaro, Mexico. Now, first place, who on earth would sit around and carve 56,000 stones? Why? If you're just going to lock them up in a museum. What's your motive? I think we have evidence, very strong evidence, of man and dinosaurs living together. In 1572, an Italian peasant killed a dragon. The story goes that he was walking his cows, the small dragon came out and hissed at his cows and scared them, so he smacked it on the head and broke its neck. Killed the dragon. They got the local guy in town who was interested in scientific type stuff, a local scientist named Ulysses Aldrovandus, an Italian scientist, who got the dead body of this dragon and had it stuffed and mounted for a museum display. It wasn't the bones, it was the skin, stuffed by a taxidermist in 1572. Roman artifacts were found in Tucson, Arizona, in an old grave. Now you got to understand, the Roman Empire was, around the time of Christ. Kind of petered out about 300 years after Christ, and the political Roman Empire switched hats and became the unholy Roman Catholic Church. And so it's really continuing the same era, the same legacy. Catholic Church is a continuation of the Roman Empire. But Roman swords were found in Tucson, Arizona. Well, of course, there's lots of evidence from many sources that ever since the flood, people have been trading back and forth across the oceans. Jewish or Hebrew coins from about the time of Christ have been found in Ohio, buried in old mounds. The Hebrews came over here. The Romans came over to America. Here we are teaching the kids that Columbus was the first white man to come over here 500 years ago. I'm sorry, that's just not true. Roman artifacts are found in Tucson, Arizona. One of these swords has a dinosaur on it. So I called the guy who has the sword. His name is Tom Peterson, Arizona Historical Society. I said, Tom, and dinosaurs did not live at the same time. Now wait a minute. Does he know they did not live at the same time, or does he believe they did not live at the same time? See, his preconceived idea that evolution is true prevents him from accepting this as evidence. All he knows is, this can't be legitimate because evolution is true. But if you're willing to get rid of all your prejudices like a scientist is supposed to do, and say, hey, maybe man and dinosaurs lived at the same time. During the age of sailing ships, there are thousands of stories of people sighting sea monsters. Well, you got to understand, from about the time of Columbus, first guy really to go across the ocean in modern times, there was a 1,000-year span of history where things were very suppressed. Knowledge was suppressed. The Catholic Church really put the clamps down, and they wanted everybody in darkness. And so Columbus sailed across the ocean. Now, people had done it before, but there was the Dark Ages is a very legitimate age in history. They're going with a boat, with a sailboat. Sailboats don't make much noise going through the water. Early 1900s, you start developing steam engines, diesel engines, gasoline engines, internal combustion engines. They make a lot of noise. Now, sound travels real fast underwater. You can go underwater at one end of a lake, have somebody go a long ways away and bang two rocks together underwater, and you'll hear it, where you couldn't hear it above water, right? Put your head under in the bathtub sometime and just tap on the side of the tub. A light tap that you would never hear in the air, you will hear through the water. So since sound travels much faster and much longer, much farther through water, whales, for instance, can yell at each other or, call to each other 100 miles away. A whale can, in their songs, they say they can hear them 100 miles away underwater. Okay, during the age of sailing ships, it's pretty quiet going through the water, so my contention is maybe that's why there are so many legends of sea serpents, sea monsters. You would be able to get closer to them because your boat's not making so much noise. Whereas today with your diesel engine, they can hear you coming 100 miles away, and they've learned to avoid the shipping lanes. There are lots of stories of people sighting sea monsters. Missionary Hans Egede reported a sea monster. His great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson, S.M. McAllister, came to a meeting when I spoke up in New England someplace, Delaware, I believe. He said, oh yeah, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was Hans Egede. And in his diary, I've got the whole photocopy of the diary in one of my files there, he reported seeing a sea monster that stuck its head up even with one of the top sails on the ship. And it had two little flappers, he called it, flappers. We probably would call it a flipper. And they said it had like a mane running down its back. Of course, it may have been when it came out of the water is still dripping off of its fin, which would make it look like a horse's mane, if the water is still dripping off. Bishop Erik Pontoppidan of Norway in 1755 reported that he saw a sea monster. I believe that was off the coast of Greenland, if I remember. Hans Egede was off the coast of Greenland. Bishop to Norway, I forget where he saw it, but you can get the book, Monsters of the Sea. I've got most of these books in my library. Captain McKay tells a fascinating story about he was the captain of the HMS Daedalus. In 1848, in August of 1848, they were sailing around, and a sea monster swam under their boat. The lookout called for the captain and said, "Captain, we got a sea monster out here." So the captain came up on deck, called some more of the crew up there. They watched this sea monster for 20 minutes. He said it came so close to my boat, if I would have known it, if it would have been a man of mine acquaintance, I could have easily recognized him. He was close enough for me to recognize this creature. He said it was on a steady course, didn't deviate. He said it was going against the wind. And if you read the account that McKay left behind, it rules out all other possibilities that people have tried to use to explain this. Some people say, well, it was just a piece of driftwood. They don't go against the wind. It was going against the wind and against the current. These sailboat captains, take careful records on all that kind of stuff, which way's the current, which way's the wind. I mean, they're very dependent on those things. The sailors on board begged the captain not to mention this in the logbook. They said, "Captain, please don't mention this in the logbook." Why would they do that? Yeah, they're going to get laughed at. You go back from a long fishing trip and say, "Hey, we saw a sea monster." Average landlubber, who doesn't ever go out, he looks at the ocean once in a while. How far out? You can see out 5-6 miles. The ocean's huge, You look like the idiot Russian astronauts who went up, circled the moon, came back and said, "Well, we didn't see God, so he must not exist." Think about it. You didn't see him, so he doesn't exist. You go out and look at the beach, I don't see any dinosaurs, therefore they don't exist. That's the attitude some people have. For one thing, right now, how much of the ocean would you guess is being observed by people? Right now? Not much. Ships, even today, ships generally stick to the shipping lanes because they take advantage of the currents. I mean, if you're in a giant boat, carrying a zillion pounds of material, and you're only going, 11 miles an hour, and you can get in a current that'll carry you an extra 3 miles an hour, that cuts 4 days off your time going across the ocean. Meanwhile, you're paying all this crew 4 days' pay. It just makes common sense, Figure out where the currents are and follow the currents. Which means there are large sections of the ocean that are never sailed over. There's no currents there to take advantage of. In 1850s, there was a whaling ship called the Monongahela. Now, there's a fascinating story. You can get it at UWF Library about the Monongahela. It's in QL 89 if you go to the UWF Library. QL 89 is the section of the library that has books about Loch Ness Monster and stuff like that. Captain on board the Monongahela set sail to catch whales. It's a whaling ship. I've read the whole story. I just have a brief synopsis of it here, but the story goes basically, the lookout hollered down, "Captain, there's a sea monster out there." The sea monster was sleeping on some floating seaweed, or kelp, I think it was. The captain called the crew up on deck. They saw the sea monster. Now, this is a whaling ship. These are the guys that get in those little boats and go out there with those big harpoons and stick it in the side of a whale. You would have to be pretty brave to do something like that. He said, "Sailors, we have for years heard stories of sea monsters. How many of you have heard stories of sea monsters?" And of course, they all raised their hand. He said, "How many of you have laughed at somebody else for claiming they saw a sea monster?" Raised their hand. He said, "Fellas, there's a sea monster. We have two choices. Go back to port, report we saw a sea monster, and get laughed at the rest of our life, or go kill it and prove they exist. Any volunteers to go kill the sea monster?" He got enough volunteers to man, I think, 3 boats, whaling boats. So these guys get their harpoons, they get in these boats, they go out there after this sea monster, which is sleeping, sunbathing or something, on the kelp. They get up beside it and they harpooned it. I think the story says they stuck 5 harpoons in it. Sea monster, of course, woke up right away, jerked his head around, and they said that the jaw on this creature was about 8 feet long. When it came around, it hit the captain, who was standing up in his boat, knocked him out of the boat. The serpent was just twitching around, seeing what stuck me in the side. You know, why do I have a pain here all of a sudden? So he twitches around, knocks the captain unconscious. A couple of sailors jump in, grab the captain, drag him out, put him in the boat, you know, revive him. Meanwhile, this sea serpent slides off the kelp and heads for the bottom. And they have the ropes, and they're pouring water on as this rope is whizzing out over the front of the boat. They got this little thing, the gunwale, I think they call it, where the rope goes out. No, the gunwale's the back. But the rope goes whizzing out through this little V-shaped thing to keep it in place. And the sea serpent is going to the bottom. They realize they're going to run out of rope, so they tie another rope on. If I remember the story, it's been 7 years since I read it, but the sea monster went down about 1,500 feet. 1 or 2 of the harpoons pulled loose, the other one stuck. Here's this sea monster way down underwater with these ropes hooked to harpoons that are still stuck in him. Of course, what a harpoon is supposed to do, it's supposed to, you know, make it bleed to death. That's why they kill the whales. After a long time, I forget, I think it was several hours, but it was quite a while, one of the sailors hollered, "He's coming up." The rope is going slack. So they start pulling in the rope, and about 1/8 of a mile away from them, the sea monster surfaces and it's thrashing around as it's dying. They said it apparently had stayed down too long because it coughed up its own lungs. Its lungs exploded, and the lungs were hanging out of its mouth. They waited till it thrashed around and died. They dragged it over to the boat and cut it up. They measured it 103 feet long. I believe the number was 103 feet 6 inches. I mean, they really measured it. The sailor said it had 2 blowholes, like a whale does. You have 2